So a few people have been asking in the comments like, hey, isn't the information we have about Jesus written thousands of years after his life? And isn't it kind of just pushing a narrative? So I wanted to talk about it. Paul, who wrote 2/3 of the New Testament, visited a Greek city in Corinth where he started a church in AD 50. And then in AD 55, he wrote a letter to them. And within that letter, he says, hey, I'm passing on to you what I received as most important. And what's he referring to? Where did he pick this up? Well, Paul picked this up on a visit to Jerusalem where he hung out with James, the brother of Jesus, and Peter, who was actually leading the Jesus movement in AD 36. Now, scholars think that Jesus died somewhere between AD 30 and AD 33, which means that what Paul is retelling and writing in this letter could be as early as 3 to 6 years after the death of Jesus. Then you got Mark's biography on the life of Jesus. Mark traditionally is considered the first biography written. And what's really interesting about Mark is that he's kind of all over the shop. He doesn't really follow a chronological sequence until he gets to the Passion narrative. And the Passion narrative is about the death and the resurrection of Jesus, but he follows a very sequential sequence there, which leads scholars to think that Mark's drawing upon an earlier source. Now, most scholars believe that Mark wrote this document before the fall of Jerusalem temple in AD 70, which means this source that Mark draws upon must have existed before of that. With scholars dating Mark's document before the fall of Jerusalem temple in AD 70, it could be as early as late AD 40s that it was written with this source existing. So there are two really early sources from Jesus within the first couple of years and couple of decades after his life, not thousands of years later. Run the intro. Now that was a lot of numbers, so let's put that into some historical context. If we take other figures who lived around or just a little bit after Jesus, what we discover is, for example, the Roman historian Livy, the first manuscripts we have of him come 3 centuries after he lived. When you look at Tacitus and Sotinus, we don't have manuscripts of them until the 9th century. Yet we don't look at their records and we don't look at their documents and think they're anything less than historical. So why don't we do the same with Jesus? Now, when it comes to the dating of Mark's biography, we can see that even if it is the later dating of AD 70, that's still pretty close historically to the life of Jesus in relation to like Livy and Sotinus and Tacitus. But why is it that scholars date it around that time period? Well, there's a couple of assumptions they have. Firstly, they say that the theology of Mark is quite developed. And secondly, they think a reference in Mark chapter 13 is referencing the fall of the Jerusalem temple. But let's look at those two assumptions. Firstly, to say that the theology of Mark is developed means that at one time it was primitive. But what if Mark just recorded accurately the words of Jesus? Wouldn't you expect Jesus' theology, if he was God, to come out already fully formed? So that doesn't necessarily hold water. The second assumption is because of Mark 13, where people believe that Jesus is predicting the fall of the Jerusalem temple. But if we look at the language that Jesus uses, it seems quite reasonable that Jesus could also actually be talking about the fall of the Jerusalem temple in 586 BC under the Babylonians. So even though there might be a few slight challenges with some of the dating and whether it's, 20 years after or 30 years after, what you see is in terms of historical data, it is a really, really short time period. And so you shouldn't have to worry about whether we have sources close to the life of Jesus, because we have them closer than any other historical figure. Hey, thanks so much for watching the video. I hope you can begin to see that the sources we have the life of Jesus are actually closer than what you might expect. And if this raises more questions for you, pop them in the comments below.